Amadou Diallo didn't look like a headline. He looked like a young man with a dream in his back pocket. If you passed him on the street in the Bronx in the late 90s, you'd probably only notice two things. His polite half-smile, and how he always said, "thank you," even when he didn't have to. He was born in 1975 in Liberia, to a Guinean family that moved often, building businesses in places most people were trying to leave. His father was a regional importer, electronics, fabrics, small goods, nothing glamorous, but enough to keep the family moving upward. Amadou was the oldest of 4 children. And in West Africa, that isn't just a birth order. It's a job description: be responsible, speak last, work first, protect everyone younger than you. Kids who grow up like that don't chase trouble. They chase opportunity. At 23, Amadou left Africa and followed opportunity around the planet. Thailand, Germany, eventually, America. New York was loud and judgmental, a place that could chew you up in a week. But to him it felt like possibility. He didn't need wealth, just a chance. During the day, he sold phone cards, t-shirts, videos, little things that tourists and locals bought without thinking. At night, he studied computer courses and English. When he got paid, he sent money back home. For himself, he saved coins in a jar. For his family, he wired dollars. He lived in a tiny apartment, 2C, Wheeler Avenue, a cramped box that he shared with hope, ambition, and barely any furniture. If you asked the people who knew him what he was like, you'd hear the same words repeated like a prayer. Soft-spoken, respectful, calm. He wasn't the guy who shouted on the sidewalk. He was the guy who nodded, held the door, and minded his business. He prayed. He worked. He dreamed. And that's where our story collides with something ugly, something that has swallowed countless true crime cases across America. Misidentification. Not the TV kind, where detectives chase the wrong suspect. The real-world kind, where a person gets misidentified because of stereotypes, fear, and split-second power. February 3, 1999. A cold night in the Bronx. Not dangerous on paper, but full of shadows that played tricks on the mind. Wheeler Avenue was quiet, the kind of street where nothing really happens, until it does. And on that night, 4 NYPD officers from an elite street crime unit rolled through the block, hunting a suspect in a rape case. They weren't in uniforms. They weren't in a marked car. They were undercover, dressed like regular New Yorkers, driving an unmarked Ford Taurus. Their job was to find dangerous criminals before they struck again. Their nickname inside the department was, "We Own the Night." That should give you an idea of the attitude. When their headlights cut across Diallo's building, they saw a man standing in the vestibule of the front door. Small. Thin. Dark jacket. Hands in pockets. Not doing anything wrong, just existing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. One officer thought he looked suspicious. Another thought he matched the description of a wanted suspect. Here's where the story flips from calm to chaos, quickly. They jumped out of the car. Not gently. Not slow. They moved with the confidence of men convinced they'd found the person they were looking for. They shouted commands, but here's the tragedy. Amadou spoke polite English, but not fast aggressive New York English. He froze, confused, and reached into his pocket for something he had reached for 1,000 times before. His wallet. And this is where the world fractures. Where everything becomes before and after. Where the police saw a gun. And Diallo held ID. One officer yelled. Another stumbled backward. In a matter of seconds, panic turned into gunfire. 41 bullets tore through the hallway, the doorframe, the walls, and Amadou's body. He never said a single threatening word. He never raised a weapon. He never even moved toward them. When it was over, the officers stood there in shell casings. And the quiet 23-year-old immigrant with polite eyes and a borrowed American dream lay dying on his own doorstep. News traveled faster than truth. Neighbors screamed. Windows lit up. Within hours, the immigrant kid shot by cops became a citywide headline. Within days, it became national. Within weeks, it became global. People marched through the streets chanting his name. Diallo. Not victim, not suspect, not case. Just Diallo, a person reduced to a symbol. But true crime isn't just about the moment the trigger gets pulled. It's about everything that leads up to it. The misunderstandings, the assumptions, the fear, and the seconds that nobody can rewind. And to understand how a wallet became a weapon, we have to rewind. Amadou Diallo grew up believing the world rewarded hard work. He watched his father travel for deals, his mother raise children, his country survive conflict. He learned that the quiet way was the safe way. Eyes down, hands calm, no sudden moves. If life pushes you, don't push back, endure. So when 4 men he didn't recognize jumped out of a car and rushed him, he panicked. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't run. He did the logical immigrant thing. He tried to show identification. He tried to prove he was allowed to exist in that space. But the moment he reached into his pocket, the world around him interpreted his fear as aggression. The officers later claimed they believed he was reaching for a weapon. They said they feared for their lives. But listen closely. Not one bullet wound was found in his back. They shot him from the front, as if they weren't fleeing danger, but running straight through it. That is the part of the story that haunts people. Because Amadou Diallo didn't live a violent life. He didn't die fighting police. He died trying to explain himself. Think about that. He left Africa chasing opportunity, crossed continents, survived culture shock, learned languages, built a quiet routine. Only to be mistaken for someone he wasn't. And killed before he could even speak. You know those true crime cases where the killer stalks and ambushes? The ones where you think, why didn't anyone help them? Diallo's case is the inverse. Here, the threat didn't hide in shadows. It arrived with flashing badges and split-second certainty. And it wasn't hatred that pulled the trigger. It was fear, adrenaline, and a terrible assumption. The kind of deadly mix that never feels like a crime until someone is already bleeding. When the first ambulance arrived, the officers were already pacing, shell casings scattered across the vestibule. The paramedics rushed past them, trying to reach the man on the ground. But there was no tension left to cut, only silence and the smell of gunpowder. Amadou Diallo was already gone. Word spread like static through the neighborhood. People poured into the streets, hugging coats around their chests as if the cold air itself had turned hostile. A mother screamed through her window. A man cried out in disbelief. The moment the officers realized they had shot an unarmed man, the story stopped being tactical. It became human. It became irreversible. It took less than 24 hours for the press to find the name. Amadou Diallo. No criminal record. No weapon. Just a wallet. In the newspapers, his face appeared beside words like mistaken, unarmed, and 41 shots. 41. A number so extreme that it didn't feel like a statistic, it felt like a confession. The NYPD moved fast. They had to. The officers were pulled off the street. Detectives took statements. Internal affairs arrived. The mayor held press conferences. Every camera pointed at the same question. How could 4 trained officers shoot 41 times at a man who never fired once? The officers told their side. They had been hunting a suspect linked to a violent rape. The man in the doorway looked similar. He acted nervous. He didn't comply. When he reached into his jacket, they saw a gun. One officer opened fire, another fell backward, and the rest reacted like soldiers ambushed in a war zone. To them, it was a nightmare replayed in blinding flashes of muzzle fire. To everyone else, it looked like one thing. Fear misinterpreting a black immigrant's existence as a threat. New York didn't just react, it ignited. Activists marched. Politicians gave statements. College students skipped class to protest in the streets. For many, this wasn't an isolated tragedy, it was the culmination of old wounds. Rodney King in L.A. Malice Green in Detroit. Eleanor bumpers in the Bronx. The same pattern written in different zip codes. The protests outside police headquarters were relentless. They chanted his name like a prayer. Diallo. 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 Hundreds of people were arrested, including civil rights leaders, local pastors, and even celebrities. They weren't fighting the 4 officers. They were fighting the system that made the 4 officers possible. Diallo's parents arrived from West Africa. They came to New York hoping to see their son living a life he had worked for. Instead, they found themselves standing in a morgue, identifying him under fluorescent lights. The quiet dignity they carried shattered everyone who met them. Their grief wasn't loud. It was devastating precisely because it was calm. Pain without theatrics becomes unbearable to witness. Then came the trial. It was supposed to be held in the Bronx, where the shooting happened. Where the community could see the wheels of justice turn. But the defense argued that local outrage would bias the jury. The judge agreed. The trial was moved to Albany. That decision sent a message. Justice would be handled at arm's length. In court, the 4 officers sat in suits. No undercover jackets, no holsters, no adrenaline. Just 4 men who said they were scared. Their testimony painted a picture of confusion and panic. A chain reaction of fear happening in less than 2 seconds. One of them described firing until his gun clicked empty. Another said he didn't even realize the others were shooting until he smelled gunpowder. The prosecution tried to reframe it. They showed photos of the vestibule. The angles. The distance. The bullet holes in the wall, the door, the floor. The lawyer asked a question that hung over the courtroom like smoke. Where was the danger? And this is where the case split in 2. The law didn't ask whether Amadou Diallo was innocent. It asked whether the officer's fear was reasonable. In American courts, reasonable fear is a phrase with the weight of stone. It can outweigh logic, evidence, or tragedy. It can turn split-second judgment into legal justification. The jury deliberated. The city waited. Diallo's parents prayed. Then the verdict came. Not guilty. All 4 officers. The world collectively exhaled, but not relief. Something darker. A kind of exhaustion reserved for stories where the ending feels pre-written. The Bronx erupted. Not with riots, New York had seen those before, but with something quieter and more corrosive. Disbelief. People didn't scream into the streets. They retreated into apartments, shaking their heads like a nation murmuring the same word. Again. The NYPD paid the Diallo family $3 million in a civil settlement. Some saw it as compensation. Others saw it as hush money. His mother accepted it not because it was justice, but because funerals cost money and grief has bills. But the case did change things. The street crime unit, the elite squad whose motto was, "We own the night," was disbanded. Critics said it was long overdue. Supporters said the city became more dangerous without it. Neither argument mattered to Amadou. He had already paid the highest price. In the years that followed, every time a police shooting made headlines, his name resurfaced. Sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted. Sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a question. How many more mistakes would it take? People always ask how Amadou Diallo is remembered. Not as a symbol, not as protest footage, not as a case file. But as a person. Ask the people who knew him. The soft-spoken smile. The polite nod. The young man who dreamed of owning a business. And sending money back to his family. He never fired a gun. He never committed a crime. He never threatened anyone. He simply reached for his wallet. And that's the most haunting ending true crime can give you. A young immigrant who crossed oceans for a better life was killed because someone mistook his hope for a threat. Because sometimes the most terrifying monsters in true crime aren't killers lurking in alleys. They're split seconds of fear, held by people with the authority to act on it. And so, the story of Amadou Diallo isn't just a case. It's a mirror. It forces us to ask, how many times in history has someone died not because of who they were, but who they were mistaken for? Before you ever hear the first news report, before the first protest sign is painted, before the cameras arrive, a life has already been lost. And somewhere on a cold Bronx sidewalk, in the doorway of a building lit by cheap yellow bulbs, a young man once reached for his wallet. He thought it might save him. Instead, it became the last thing he ever held.